Would you pray with me? Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. And Jesus stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. This story of the death of Lazarus is layered with challenging theology, but I find this one sentence to be the hardest part to process. Jesus hears that his dear friend is very sick, but he does not drop everything to go and see him. He waits. It wasn't that he was held up. He intentionally stays where he is, delays, drags his feet. Why? Many commentators suggest that with the traveling time required for the messenger to make the distance back, it really wouldn't have mattered when Jesus left. He could never have gotten there in time. But I don't buy that. Biblical scholars who know a whole lot more than we do about the reality of death and burial in the first century make somewhat of a more credible claim. They tell us that by waiting 2 days, Jesus ensures that by the time he arrived, Lazarus would have been in the tomb 4 days, meaning that his spirit, which according to the Jewish tradition of the time stayed close to the body for 3 days, it ensured that his spirit would most certainly be gone. He would be really and truly dead, beyond hope. Now, had we read the rest of the story where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, instead of ending it where we did, we would see that in ensuring that Lazarus would be dead, by waiting as long as he did, Jesus makes the miracle of raising him back to life that much more impressive. But that sounds rather callous and self-serving. So it was all just to enhance the miraculous special effects? That doesn't sound like the Jesus I know. Theologians will tell us that John's gospel is making a point about the identity of Jesus and his relationship to God. They will tell us that this resurrection is a preview of the big one to come and sets all kinds of action in motion so that Jesus could meet his destiny. That could be right. But my heart goes to the human part of all of this. Jesus loved these people. They were like family to him. And they were in pain. His dear friend Lazarus was deathly ill, and Jesus waited too long to help, and Lazarus died. Scholarship and theology aside, all I can think about when I read this part of the story is, where was Jesus when they needed him? Have you ever asked that question? Have you ever experienced the tragic loss of someone and wondered, where was God? In that moment of grief and loss, we don't really care about the theological implications or the possibility that God knows what God is doing. All we know is that our loved one is gone and our lives are devastated, and God did nothing about it. Recently, I was counseling a family that lost their 23-year-old daughter to a sudden accident. This young woman had astounded everyone by registering online to have all of her organs and tissues donated in the event of her death. As a healthy 21-year-old, she had done this. As they realized that she would never recover from her brain damage, the organ donor folks met with the family. They spoke of this young woman's remarkable generosity and assured the family that 8 people's lives would be saved or healed because of the organ transplants made possible by her death. For those of us who can step back from this, those of us whose hearts have not been shattered into 1,000 pieces, we can say, this truly is a resurrection story. This truly is a sign of life coming out of death. But for the mother, she could only cry out in pain. I don't give a damn that 8 lives were saved, she said. I want my daughter back. I want my daughter back. Where was Jesus when she needed him? It's a question we cannot avoid, and it can be a question that challenges even the strongest of faiths. Whenever we choose to read a text from the Bible, we must always remember that we are only getting part of the story. The Bible was not written in chapters and verse. That artificial structure was added later. No, the original stories were shared as a whole from start to finish. Experiences and characters build on themselves, and the stories have allusions and symbols and references all their own. If we only work with a snippet, we risk losing the bigger meaning. And this is especially important to remember about the Gospels, for each of them is telling a larger story through smaller ones. In this church, we often use the lectionary cycle of readings, which are assigned by the larger Christian church, and through them we are offered a small part of the story to share and explore each Sunday. This Sunday, however, I chose the text myself to focus on our beatitude of this day, "Blessed are those who mourn." And not only did I not use the whole story, I even ended it before we got to the happy occasion of Lazarus' resurrection. At the risk of losing the larger meaning, I did this because I hoped to emphasize something we tend to want to avoid. Too often, when we're reading the Bible, we want to skip over the pain and the heartache that is so apparent in the gospel stories because we want to get to the good stuff. We want to get to the part that assures us that we are safe and loved and that life will always triumph over death. I get that. It's at the heart of our faith, and we need to hear it. But unless we are willing to wait in the uncertainty, to spend some time in the heart of the darkness, the light will have little meaning for us. Unless we are willing to test it, our faith won't matter much. And testing our faith, testing the depth of our own relationship with God, is what this journey of our spiritual lives, and especially this journey of Lent, is all about. We intentionally set aside this season because we rarely head into the wilderness willingly. Lent forces us to do so. It runs counter to our desire to keep things comfortable and familiar and safe. Yet it can also feel like a contradiction of what we know and believe so strongly in our hearts that Jesus came to do, which is to offer us life and offer it abundantly. What we often do, though, is confuse an abundant life with a pain-free life. And Jesus never offers us a pain-free life. What he does promise, though, is that in our pain and through our pain, we will find abundant meaning and purpose and grace. We will understand more deeply what it means to be truly human, and only by experiencing the depth of our humanity can we ever come close to experiencing the reality of God. In Naima's heartbreakingly honest story that she shared with us today, we see the power of grief laid bare. We see that true sorrow can ultimately be a gift, an unwelcome one at first, that puts us in touch with the heart of the world. Naima was no stranger to death, but for years she didn't know how to mourn. It wasn't until her tears could flow that she got in touch with her own heart and God's heart. She spent a lifetime protecting herself against the vulnerability of loss, and she numbed herself rather than face into it. No one asks for grief. No one wishes to mourn. But as Naima shared with us, the alternative is to live in the denial of true relationships, of real human experience. It is ultimately to deny the existence of love, for we grieve in proportion to our love, which means that if we are living and loving fully, it will hurt a lot. It hurt Jesus a lot. our passage ends with Jesus standing by the tomb of his friend, weeping. What must he have been feeling? We can only imagine. But we do know this. Jesus never avoided the pain of being human. In fact, he sought it out. He went where the suffering was, and he shared in ours with us. And that's where he invites us to follow him. And it is this type of faith that most of us would rather avoid. We want our Christmas, but not our Advent. We want our Easter, but not our Lent. We want our resurrection, but not the confusion and despair of Good Friday. We want to be comforted, but we don't want to mourn. The outrageous and paradoxical truth that Jesus offers us this morning is that true comfort is only possible through mourning. For Jesus, comfort is not the absence of pain, it is the presence of God. And we cannot feel God if we keep our own painful feelings at arm's length. But of course, Jesus' tears are not the end of the story, and they never will be. If we take this story to the end as John intended for us to do, we will see that light and that hope and that truth, that abundance that Jesus brings. But we will also see that even in that abundance, pain is never far away. For if we take the story further, we see that indeed Jesus does raise Lazarus from the dead. And yes, the people are roundly impressed by this miracle. Many walk away as believers. It would be nice to leave it there. But we also see that this miraculous resurrection is the very act that caused the religious leaders to call for Jesus' death. This time, he went too far. So in his 2 days of waiting, perhaps Jesus was making a choice. Perhaps he was weighing the cost of what he was about to do. Theologian John Vandelar looks at it this way. Jesus could ignore the whole thing, grieve with Mary and Martha, and then go on his way, knowing that he could probably escape the inevitable. Or he could give life back to Lazarus and seal his own death. John's gospel makes this clear when later it says that the Pharisees called a council to decide what to do with this miracle worker who was causing the people to believe he was the Messiah, the one come to free Israel from Rome. Rome will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation, they said, prompting Caiaphas, the high priest, to utter these words. It is better for one man to die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed. And Jesus' fate is sealed. Perhaps his tears at the tomb were not just for Lazarus, but for himself as well. For in embracing the life he had chosen, he also invited his death. The two are never very far apart. And to live in their tension is what it really means to follow him. So blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who love life enough to risk its loss. Blessed are those who love people enough to have their heart break. Blessed are those who are willing to go into the dark and scary places of the human heart, to welcome the grief, to challenge the power of the world, and to put it all on the line so that abundant life may indeed be found. Amen.